The black sedan pulled slowly through the wrought iron gates of Greenwood Cemetery, its engine barely audible against the October wind that stripped the last golden leaves from the ancient oaks. Margaret Sinclair pressed her palm against the cool window and watched the endless rows of granite monuments pass by like silent sentinels. Each headstone seemed to whisper the same cruel truth that had echoed in her mind for 3 days now. Robert was gone. Where are you watching this story unfold from today? Whether you're dealing with family drama in Texas or watching from a cozy apartment in Maine, we all know how quickly people can show their true colors when money is involved. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from. The driver, a kind elderly man from the funeral home, glanced at her through the rearview mirror with sympathetic eyes. Margaret had insisted on riding alone to the service, despite the funeral director's gentle suggestion that family members typically traveled together. Family. The word felt foreign on her tongue now, bitter as the black coffee she had abandoned on her kitchen counter that morning. As the sedan approached the chapel, Margaret could see them gathered on the pristine stone steps like a murder of crows in their expensive black attire. The Blackwood family had arrived early, naturally. They always did when there was something to claim, something to possess, something to inherit. Victoria Blackwood Hampton stood at the center of the group, her silver hair swept into an elaborate chignon that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget. She wore a black Chanel suit that fit her tall, angular frame perfectly, and diamond earrings that caught the pale morning light like tiny stars of privilege. Robert's younger brother Charles stood beside Victoria, his hands clasped behind his back in a military bearing that he had never actually earned. His wife Penelope clung to his arm, her red-rimmed eyes darting nervously between the arriving mourners as if cataloging who mattered and who could be safely ignored. Their son James, all sharp elbows and entitled smirk, checked his platinum Rolex with obvious impatience. The sedan came to a gentle stop near the chapel entrance. Margaret took a deep breath and smoothed her simple black dress, the one she had purchased from a department store 3 years ago for Robert's business dinner. It was modest, respectful, and utterly unremarkable compared to the designer mourning attire that surrounded her like a fortress of exclusion. As Margaret stepped onto the gravel path, the conversation among the Blackwood family members ceased with surgical precision. Victoria's pale blue eyes swept over Margaret's appearance with the efficiency of a customs inspector searching for contraband. Her perfectly painted lips pursed almost imperceptibly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both disdain and disappointment in a single expression. Margaret walked toward the chapel entrance, her low heels crunching softly on the gravel. The Blackwood family parted before her like the Red Sea, but their movement was born of reluctance rather than respect. She could feel their eyes following her every step, cataloging every perceived flaw in her appearance, every sign of her obvious unworthiness to stand among them. Charles cleared his throat and stepped forward with the bearing of a man accustomed to taking charge. His voice carried the cultivated accent of old money when he spoke. "Margaret," he said, "we were wondering if you might prefer to sit toward the back of the chapel. The front rows are traditionally reserved for blood family during these solemn occasions." Victoria nodded sagely, her expression radiating false sympathy like heat from a dying fire. "Charles is absolutely right, dear. We wouldn't want you to feel uncomfortable surrounded by people you barely know. After all, you and Robert were only married for what, 2 years? Some of us have been loving him for 30. Penelope's voice joined the chorus with practiced sweetness. "There are some lovely seats near the middle of the chapel, Margaret. You'll have a perfect view of the service from there, and you won't have to worry about all the family business discussions that tend to happen in the front rows." James snorted softly, a sound he tried to disguise as clearing his throat. His father shot him a warning glance, but the damage was done. The young man's contempt hung in the air like incense, acrid and unmistakable. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach, a familiar sensation she had experienced countless times during family gatherings over the past 2 years. It was the feeling of being tolerated rather than accepted, endured rather than embraced. She had hoped that grief might temporarily bridge the chasm between herself and Robert's family, that shared loss might create common ground where none had existed before. She was wrong. Other mourners began arriving, colleagues from Robert's law firm, neighbors from their quiet suburban street, friends from the country club, where Robert had played golf every Saturday morning. Margaret watched as each group was greeted warmly by the Blackwood family, as handshakes and embraces were exchanged with genuine affection and respect. She remained standing alone near the chapel steps, a ghost at her own husband's funeral. Victoria approached her again, this time with Penelope flanked beside her like a lieutenant prepared for battle. The older woman's smile was as sharp as broken crystal when she spoke. "Margaret, darling, we've been meaning to ask about your plans. Now that poor Robert is gone, we imagine you'll be wanting to return to your family in whatever little town you came from. Ohio, wasn't it?" "Actually," Margaret began, but Victoria continued speaking as if she hadn't heard a word. "We completely understand that staying here would be far too expensive for someone in your position. This neighborhood has become simply outrageous in terms of property values. Even Robert used to complain about the taxes and maintenance costs. A single woman of modest means would find it quite overwhelming, I'm sure." Penelope nodded enthusiastically, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. "We know some excellent real estate agents who specialize in quick sales. They could probably have Robert's house on the market within the month. Of course, after the mortgage is paid off and the estate settles its debts, there might be enough left over for a nice little apartment somewhere more suitable." Margaret felt heat rising in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady when she replied, "Thank you for your concern, but I haven't made any decisions about my future yet." Victoria's laugh was like wind chimes made of ice. "Oh, darling, sometimes decisions make themselves. Reality has a way of clarifying things quite quickly, especially when fantasy meets financial responsibility." The chapel bells began to toll, their bronze voices calling the mourners to gather for Robert's final farewell. Margaret watched as the Blackwood family swept toward the entrance in a coordinated formation, their black clothing creating a human wall of exclusion. She followed at a respectful distance, her heart heavy with more than just grief. Inside the chapel, the family claimed the first 3 pews with military efficiency. Margaret found herself directed to a seat in the 4th row, close enough to hear every whispered comment, but far enough away to emphasize her status as an outsider looking in. She sat alone while the Blackwood family filled their chosen pews like shareholders at an exclusive board meeting. As the service began and the minister's voice filled the sacred space with words of comfort and eternal rest, Margaret closed her eyes and remembered the man she had loved. Robert had been different from his family, gentler somehow, less concerned with bloodlines and bank balances. He had seen something in her that his relatives remained determined to ignore. Behind her closed eyelids, Margaret allowed herself a small smile. They had no idea what was coming. None of them did. Tomorrow's will reading was going to be very educational for the Blackwood family. Very educational indeed. The reception at the Blackwood estate unfolded like a carefully choreographed ballet of exclusion. Margaret stood in the grand foyer beneath the crystal chandelier that had witnessed 3 generations of family celebrations, her modest black dress a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. The Persian rugs beneath her feet probably cost more than most people's cars, and the oil paintings lining the mahogany-paneled walls depicted stern ancestors who seemed to glare down at her with the same disapproval she felt from their living descendants. Victoria moved through the crowd of mourners with the grace of a practiced hostess, accepting condolences and directing conversations with subtle efficiency. Her voice carried across the marble-floored room as she spoke to Robert's former law partners about his dedication to the firm, his brilliant legal mind, and his unfortunate tendency toward charitable impulses that sometimes clouded his judgment. The last comment was delivered with a meaningful glance in Margaret's direction. Charles had positioned himself near the antique bar cart, pouring generous measures of aged whiskey for the male guests, while Penelope circulated with silver trays of canapes prepared by the family's longtime caterer. Their coordination was flawless, born of decades practicing the art of elite hospitality. Margaret watched them work the room and realized she was witnessing a machine in motion, each family member playing their assigned role in maintaining the Blackwood legacy. James stood near the French doors that opened onto the estate's manicured gardens, his expensive suit tailored to perfection and his Harvard-class ring catching the afternoon light. He was holding court with several younger guests, regaling them with stories about his upcoming promotion at the family's investment firm and his plans to expand their portfolio into international markets. His voice grew louder as he detailed his vision for modernizing the company's approach to wealth management. At precisely 3 o'clock, a silver-haired gentleman in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit entered the reception room, carrying a leather briefcase that spoke of serious business. Margaret recognized him immediately as Theodore Harrison, the family's longtime attorney who had handled Robert's legal affairs for over 20 years. His arrival created a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Conversations grew quieter and more focused as family members gravitated toward him like metal filings drawn to a magnet. Victoria approached Mr. Harrison with outstretched arms and the kind of warm smile she reserved for people who mattered. "Theodore, how thoughtful of you to join us during this difficult time. Robert would have been so pleased to know you were here to honor his memory." The attorney accepted her embrace with professional warmth before setting his briefcase down on the mahogany side table near the fireplace. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to delivering important information. "Victoria, Charles, I wanted to speak with the family about tomorrow's will reading. There are several matters we need to address before we convene at my office." Charles stepped forward, his military bearing more pronounced in the presence of legal authority. "Of course, Theodore. We're all eager to settle Robert's affairs as efficiently as possible. The family appreciates your guidance during this transition." Mr. Harrison nodded solemnly before continuing. "The reading is scheduled for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. All beneficiaries named in the will have been properly notified, and I expect the process to be relatively straightforward." Robert was quite thorough in his documentation, and his wishes are clearly stated. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers drummed lightly against her champagne flute as she processed this information. "I assume the primary beneficiaries will be family members, as is traditional." Robert always understood the importance of keeping the family legacy intact. Penelope moved closer to the group, her voice pitched low with false discretion. "We're particularly concerned about ensuring that Robert's assets remain within the family bloodline. He was always so sentimental about certain people, but we trust his final decisions reflected proper judgment." Mr. Harrison's expression remained diplomatically neutral as he glanced around the room. "All beneficiaries will be present tomorrow, and Robert's wishes will be honored exactly as he specified. I think you'll find his decisions were quite deliberate and well-considered." James approached the group with the confident stride of someone accustomed to inheriting rather than earning. "Theodore, I've been reviewing some of the company's financial projections, and I'm ready to assume greater responsibility for managing the family's business interests. I hope Roberts will reflect his confidence in my abilities." The attorney's smile was polite but noncommittal. "Tomorrow's reading will address all matters of business succession and asset distribution." Robert spent considerable time ensuring that his decisions reflected both family interests and legal obligations. Across the room, Margaret stood near the window that overlooked the estate's rose garden, her presence apparently forgotten by the family deep in their inheritance discussions. She could hear every word of their conversation, each assumption and expectation laid bare with breathtaking arrogance. Their casual dismissal of her existence would have been amusing if it weren't so cruel. Victoria's voice rose slightly as her confidence grew. "I imagine Margaret will receive some small charitable bequest, something appropriate for a brief marriage. Perhaps enough to help her relocate somewhere more suitable to her background and education level." Charles nodded approvingly at his sister's assessment. Robert was always generous to a fault, but I'm sure his final decisions prioritized family stability over temporary sentimentality. "Margaret seems like a nice enough girl, but she'll need to find her own way in the world now." Penelope's contribution dripped with manufactured sympathy. "The poor dear probably has no idea how expensive it is to maintain Robert's lifestyle. The house alone costs a fortune in property taxes and maintenance. She'll be much happier in a modest apartment somewhere affordable." James laughed softly, the sound carrying just enough volume to ensure Margaret could hear his words. "Maybe she can find work as a secretary or something. I mean, what other skills could she possibly have developed during her brief vacation from reality?" The conversation continued for another hour, each family member contributing their assessment of Margaret's future prospects and their relief at reclaiming what they considered rightfully theirs. They discussed dividing Robert's art collection, deciding who would inherit his vintage car collection, and planning how to best utilize his investment portfolio for maximum family benefit. Margaret maintained her position near the window, her expression serene despite the verbal assault she endured. She sipped her tea slowly and watched the autumn light fade across the garden where she and Robert had spent countless peaceful evenings discussing their shared dreams and plans for the future. Plans that apparently included surprises the Blackwood family couldn't begin to imagine. As the reception began winding down and guests started departing with final condolences and promises to stay in touch, the family gathered near the fireplace for what appeared to be a private toast. Victoria raised her crystal champagne flute high above her head, her voice carrying clearly across the now empty room. To Robert's memory and to the family legacy that will finally return to where it belongs. Tomorrow marks the beginning of a new chapter for the Blackwood name, one guided by proper judgment and family wisdom. Charles raised his glass in agreement. To bringing our inheritance home where it belongs and ensuring that family assets remain in family hands. James added his voice to the toast with youthful enthusiasm. To the future of Blackwood Investments and the expansion plans that will honor Robert's memory while securing our family's position for generations to come. Penelope completed the ritual with satisfied finality. To new beginnings and proper endings, and to the wisdom that comes with time and experience. They drank together in perfect harmony, their faces glowing with anticipation and entitlement. Margaret watched from across the room as they celebrated their assumed victory, their premature triumph over the outsider who had briefly disrupted their careful plans. She set her teacup down on the windowsill and gathered her simple black purse, preparing to leave the estate that had never truly welcomed her presence. As she walked toward the grand entrance hall, Victoria's voice followed her with cold politeness. "Margaret, dear, do try to get some rest tonight. Tomorrow's reading might be emotionally difficult for you, but remember that change often leads to new opportunities. I'm sure you'll find your place in the world soon enough." Margaret paused at the threshold and turned back to face the family that had just spent the afternoon planning her dismissal from their lives. Her voice was quiet but steady when she replied, "Thank you for your concern, Victoria. I think tomorrow will indeed bring many new opportunities for everyone." She stepped out into the crisp October evening and walked slowly toward her car, leaving behind the crystal chandeliers and Persian rugs and oil paintings of disapproving ancestors. Behind her, the Blackwood family continued their celebration, toasting their assumed inheritance with expensive champagne and cheaper assumptions. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough, and with it, the education they so desperately needed. The law offices of Harrison, Mitchell and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower that pierced the downtown skyline like a crystal spear. At precisely 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, the Blackwood family assembled in the main conference room, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city Robert had called home for his entire legal career. The polished mahogany table stretched nearly the length of the room, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Victoria arrived first, naturally, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon and her navy blue suit tailored to perfection. She had chosen her outfit carefully for this momentous occasion, something appropriate for both mourning and celebration. Charles followed close behind with Penelope clinging to his arm like a nervous sparrow, her eyes bright with anticipation despite the red rimming that suggested tears shed for show rather than genuine grief. James burst through the conference room doors with the enthusiasm of a racehorse approaching the finish line. His charcoal gray suit was perfectly pressed, and his Harvard tie knotted with military precision. He carried a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained business plans and expansion strategies he intended to implement the moment his inheritance was confirmed. Margaret entered the room quietly, her simple black dress and modest jewelry creating a stark contrast to the expensive attire surrounding her. She chose a chair near the end of the table, away from the family cluster, but positioned where she could observe everyone clearly. Her hands folded calmly in her lap as she waited for the proceedings to begin. Theodore Harrison entered with his customary dignity, carrying the leather briefcase that contained Robert's final wishes. His gray suit was immaculate, and his silver hair combed with precise attention to detail. He had conducted hundreds of will readings during his 40-year career, but something about his expression suggested this particular session might prove more interesting than most. The attorney settled into his chair at the head of the table and opened his briefcase with deliberate ceremony. He withdrew a thick document bound in blue legal covers, along with several manila folders that he arranged before him like a general preparing battle plans. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic 20 stories below. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began with the standard legal preamble that had opened countless similar proceedings. This is the last will and testament of Robert Maxwell Blackwood, executed on the 15th day of September in the year of our Lord 2023, in the presence of 2 witnesses and properly notarized according to the laws of this state. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming silently against the polished table surface. Her expression radiated confident expectation, the look of someone who had waited patiently for their rightful inheritance and was finally about to claim it. The attorney continued reading through the technical language that established Robert's mental competency at the time of signing and revoked all previous wills and codicils. James shifted restlessly in his chair, obviously eager to skip past the legal formalities and reach the meat of the document. Penelope clutched Charles's hand like a lifeline, her breathing shallow with nervous anticipation. Mr. Harrison's voice took on a more personal tone as he reached the heart of the document. I, Robert Maxwell Blackwood, being of sound mind and disposing memory, do hereby give, devise, and bequeath my worldly possessions according to the following provisions, which reflect my deepest love and most carefully considered judgment. The family members exchanged glances of satisfaction, their expressions suggesting they had already mentally divided Robert's assets among themselves. Victoria's smile was particularly radiant, the look of a woman who was about to reclaim what she considered rightfully hers. To my beloved wife Margaret Elizabeth Sinclair Blackwood, Mr. Harrison continued, his voice steady and clear, I leave the family residence located at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, including all furnishings, fixtures, and personal effects contained therein, having an estimated value of $3 million. The silence that followed was absolute and electric. Victoria's carefully composed expression froze like a photograph, her mouth slightly open as if the words had physically struck her. Charles's military bearing crumpled as his shoulders sagged with shock. James dropped his leather portfolio, the sound of expensive leather hitting polished wood echoing through the suddenly airless room. Penelope was the first to find her voice, though it emerged as little more than a strangled whisper. $3 million? The house goes to her. Victoria's shock transformed into righteous indignation with remarkable speed. She turned toward Margaret with eyes that could have frozen molten steel. This is absolutely unacceptable. Robert was obviously not in his right mind when he signed this document. We demand an immediate investigation into the circumstances surrounding this will's creation. Mr. Harrison's expression remained professionally neutral as he consulted his notes. Mrs. Blackwood Hampton, I can assure you that Robert was thoroughly examined by 2 independent physicians who certified his mental competency on the day this will was signed. Their reports are part of the permanent record. James found his voice, though it cracked slightly with disbelief and growing anger. This is ridiculous. She was married to him for barely 2 years. That house has been in our family for generations. There has to be some kind of legal recourse here. The attorney's response was calm but firm. The residence was purchased solely in Robert's name using his personal funds, making it his property to dispose of as he saw fit. The bequest is legally sound and properly documented. Charles leaned forward with the bearing of a man accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. Theodore, surely there are provisions for family members who have been part of Robert's life since birth. What about the investment portfolio? The business interests? The family trust? Mr. Harrison consulted the will again before continuing. To my beloved wife Margaret Elizabeth Sinclair Blackwood, I also leave my complete investment portfolio managed by Thornfield Securities, including all stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and related financial instruments, having an estimated current value of $8 million. The second revelation hit the family like a tsunami of disbelief. Victoria's face turned ashen as the magnitude of Margaret's inheritance became clear. $8 million added to $3 million for the house meant that this woman they had dismissed as a temporary inconvenience was walking away with $11 million of what they considered family money. James shot to his feet with explosive fury, his chair rolling backward and striking the window with a sharp crack. This is absolutely insane. She manipulated him. She took advantage of a grieving widower who was obviously not thinking clearly. This cannot possibly be legal. Penelope began crying softly, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. But what about the family? What about Robert's blood relatives? What about the people who loved him his entire life? Margaret remained seated calmly at the end of the table, her expression serene despite the emotional chaos erupting around her. She had not spoken a single word since entering the conference room, but her presence seemed to fill the space like a gathering storm. Victoria's voice shook with barely controlled rage when she addressed the attorney directly. "Theodore, I am formally requesting that this will be contested on the grounds of mental incompetence and undue influence. This woman clearly manipulated my brother during his most vulnerable period." Mr. Harrison's reply was measured and professional. "You are certainly within your rights to contest the will, though I should mention there are additional provisions that require further explanation before we conclude today's reading." The family members froze as if someone had pressed a pause button on their collective outrage. Additional provisions. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, ominous and heavy with implication. For the first time since entering the conference room, Margaret spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear as crystal when she addressed the attorney directly. "Mr. Harrison, perhaps you should continue reading. I believe there are several more matters that require the family's attention." The attorney nodded gravely and returned his attention to the will, his fingers turning pages with deliberate precision. The family watched in horrified fascination as he prepared to deliver what appeared to be additional bombshells that would further shatter their assumptions about Robert's final wishes. Outside the conference room windows, the city continued its relentless pace of business and commerce, oblivious to the family drama unfolding 20 stories above the bustling streets. But inside the law office, time seemed suspended as everyone waited to learn just how deep Robert's surprises would go. Mr. Harrison turned several pages in the thick legal document before him, his experienced fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. The silence in the conference room was absolute except for the barely audible hum of the building's ventilation system and Penelope's soft sniffling as she dabbed at her ruined makeup with a tissue. The attorney's voice resumed its steady cadence as he continued reading from Robert's will. "Furthermore, I wish to acknowledge that my beloved wife Margaret Elizabeth Sinclair Blackwood was not merely my spouse, but has been my business partner and co-investor in multiple ventures spanning the past 15 years of my professional career." Victoria's head snapped up as if she had been physically slapped. Her voice emerged as a harsh whisper filled with disbelief. "Business partner? What business partner? Robert never mentioned any business partnerships with her." Mr. Harrison reached into one of his manila folders and withdrew a thick stack of documents bound with a red ribbon. "These are the corporate filings, partnership agreements, and co-ownership documents that detail Mrs. Blackwood's involvement in various business entities established by Robert between 2008 and 2023. He spread the papers across the polished mahogany table like a dealer distributing cards for a high-stakes poker game. Each document bore official seals and notary stamps, along with signatures that were clearly recognizable as belonging to both Robert and Margaret. James leaned forward to examine the papers, his face growing pale as he read the dates and dollar amounts listed in neat columns. These documents show investments totaling millions of dollars over more than a decade. How is that even possible? She was nobody when Robert met her. Charles grabbed one of the partnership agreements and scanned it quickly, his military bearing crumbling further with each line he read. "This says she provided initial capital funding for Robert's private practice expansion in 2010. Where would someone like her get that kind of money?" Mr. Harrison consulted his notes before responding with professional calm. "That brings us to another important revelation contained within Robert's will. Mrs. Margaret Elizabeth Sinclair Blackwood is the daughter of the late Edward Sinclair, who was Robert's business partner and closest friend for over 20 years before his untimely death in a car accident in 2007. The words hit the family like a physical blow. Victoria's champagne flute slipped from her nerveless fingers and shattered against the conference room floor, crystal shards scattering across the expensive carpet like fallen stars. Penelope gasped audibly and clutched Charles's arm so tightly that her knuckles turned white against his dark suit sleeve. James stood frozen with a partnership agreement half raised to his face, his mouth hanging open as he processed the implications of what he had just heard. His voice cracked when he finally managed to speak. Edward Sinclair? The Edward Sinclair who co-founded Blackwood Sinclair Investments with our grandfather? The attorney nodded gravely as he withdrew another folder from his briefcase. The same Edward Sinclair who was instrumental in building the family's wealth throughout the 1980s and 1990s. When Mr. Sinclair died unexpectedly, he left behind considerable assets that were held in trust for his daughter Margaret, who was completing her law degree at Stanford University at the time. Victoria found her voice, though it emerged as little more than a strangled croak. You're telling us that this woman is Edward Sinclair's daughter? The Edward Sinclair who was practically family to our father? Mr. Harrison's response was measured and precise. According to the documentation I have here, Robert's father made certain promises to Edward Sinclair regarding the care and protection of his daughter should anything happen to him. When Edward died in 2007, Robert took those promises very seriously indeed. He opened another folder and revealed a handwritten letter bearing the Blackwood family letterhead from 1995. This is a letter from Robert's father to Edward Sinclair, promising that the Blackwood family would always honor their partnership and ensure that Edward's children would be treated as family members with full rights to their father's investments in family enterprises. Charles reached for the letter with shaking hands, his face growing ashen as he read his father's distinctive handwriting. This promises Edward that his daughter would inherit his share of the family businesses and would be welcomed as a full partner in all future ventures. Penelope's voice was barely a whisper as the full scope of the deception became clear. So when Robert married her, he wasn't just marrying some random woman. He was fulfilling a promise made by his own father to her father decades ago. Mr. Harrison nodded solemnly before continuing with his revelations. Mrs. Blackwood holds a law degree from Stanford University, where she graduated summa cum laude in 2008. She also completed an MBA from Wharton Business School in 2011, specializing in corporate finance and investment management. James dropped the partnership agreement he had been holding, the papers fluttering to the floor like autumn leaves. She's a lawyer and has an MBA from Wharton? But she never worked. She just stayed home and played housewife. The attorney's smile was polite but knowing. Mrs. Blackwood has been working quite extensively, actually. She holds executive positions in several corporations that you may not have realized were connected to the family business empire. He withdrew yet another set of documents from his seemingly bottomless briefcase. These are the corporate registration papers showing Mrs. Blackwood as Chief Financial Officer of Riverside Development Corporation, senior partner at Meridian Consulting Group, and majority shareholder in 3 separate real estate investment trusts that have generated substantial profits over the past decade. Victoria struggled to process this cascade of revelations, her carefully constructed worldview crumbling like a house built on sand. But she never went to an office. She was always at home when we visited Robert. She acted like a typical housewife with no interests beyond domestic activities. Margaret spoke for the second time since entering the conference room, her voice carrying a note of gentle amusement. Working from home has become quite common in the modern business world, Victoria. Technology allows for remarkable flexibility in managing multiple enterprises simultaneously. The family turned to stare at Margaret as if seeing her for the first time. Gone was the mousy widow who had endured their condescension with quiet dignity. In her place sat a woman whose calm confidence suggested depths they had never bothered to explore. Charles's voice shook with growing realization. You've been managing family business interests this entire time. You've been involved in decisions that affected our financial future, and we never even knew you existed in that capacity. Mr. Harrison consulted his notes once more before delivering what appeared to be his final bombshell. Mrs. Blackwood's business acumen has been quite remarkable, actually. Under her financial guidance, the family's investment portfolio has increased in value by approximately 400% over the past 15 years. James collapsed back into his chair as if his legs had suddenly given out. 400%? She's responsible for growing our family wealth by 400%. The attorney's smile was professional but carried a hint of satisfaction. Mrs. Blackwood has been the primary architect behind the family's financial success throughout Robert's career. Her investment strategies and business partnerships have generated the wealth that you all assumed was simply inherited from previous generations. Victoria's face had gone completely white as she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their error in judgment. We treated her like she was some kind of fortune hunter who had tricked Robert into marriage. But she was already wealthy in her own right and was actually making him wealthier. Penelope's voice was barely audible as she spoke through her tears. We've been horrible to someone who was not only family by right, but who was also responsible for our financial security this entire time. Margaret remained seated calmly at the end of the conference table, watching the family's world collapse around them with the detached interest of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. Her expression suggested she had been waiting for this moment for quite some time. Mr. Harrison gathered his documents with practiced efficiency, but his tone indicated there were still more revelations to come. These discoveries represent only a portion of Robert's final wishes. There are additional provisions regarding business succession and asset distribution that will require further discussion. The Blackwood family sat in stunned silence as they absorbed the earth-shattering truth about the woman they had dismissed as an unworthy interloper. Margaret Sinclair Blackwood was not only Edward Sinclair's daughter and a brilliant businesswoman in her own right, but she had been the secret architect of their family's prosperity for over a decade. Their assumptions had been wrong. Catastrophically, completely, irrevocably wrong. Mr. Harrison allowed the family several minutes to absorb the shocking revelations about Margaret's true identity and business expertise before reaching for the final section of Robert's will. His fingers moved with deliberate precision as he turned to the pages that would complete their education in hubris and its consequences. The attorney cleared his throat before continuing with the inexorable destruction of their expectations. We now come to the matter of the Blackwood Family Trust, which was restructured in 2018 according to Robert's explicit instructions and with the unanimous approval of the Trust's board of directors. Victoria's head snapped up from where she had been staring at her hands in numb disbelief. The family trust? But that's been the foundation of our financial security for 3 generations. Surely that remains within the bloodline. Mr. Harrison consulted his documents with professional calm before delivering news that would shatter what remained of their composure. The restructuring transferred primary beneficiary status to Mrs. Margaret Elizabeth Sinclair Blackwood, in recognition of her position as Edward Sinclair's heir and her substantial contributions to the trust's growth and management. The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of traffic 20 stories below seemed to fade into nothing. James stared at the attorney as if he were speaking in a foreign language, his young face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and growing horror. Charles found his voice first, though it emerged as a strangled whisper. Primary beneficiary? You're saying the entire family trust now belongs to her. The attorney's response was measured and final. Mrs. Blackwood inherits controlling interest in Blackwood Manufacturing, which currently operates 17 facilities across 6 states and employs over 4,000 people. She also receives the family's real estate portfolio, including commercial properties in downtown Chicago, residential developments in 3 states, and the vacation compound in Aspen. Penelope made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob as the magnitude of Margaret's inheritance became clear. Each property mentioned represented millions of dollars in assets that the family had assumed would be divided among blood relatives according to traditional inheritance patterns. Mr. Harrison continued his methodical destruction of their financial expectations. Additionally, Mrs. Blackwood inherits the family's overseas investment holdings, including the shipping company based in Singapore, the technology partnerships in Germany, and the agricultural ventures in Argentina. Victoria's face had progressed beyond pale into a sickly gray color as she realized the scope of what was being transferred away from the bloodline she had spent her entire life believing would inherit everything. Her voice cracked when she managed to speak. What about the rest of us? What about Robert's siblings and their children? The attorney turned several pages before responding with information that would complete their humiliation. Victoria Blackwood Hampton receives a trust fund valued at $200,000, to be distributed in quarterly payments over 10 years. $200,000. The amount was laughably small compared to the millions being transferred to Margaret, barely enough to maintain Victoria's current lifestyle for more than a year. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembling as she processed the devastating reduction in her expectations. Charles and Penelope receive a combined trust fund of $150,000, also distributed quarterly over 10 years. Mr. Harrison continued with relentless precision. Their son James receives $50,000 upon reaching age 30, provided he maintains steady employment and demonstrates financial responsibility. James shot to his feet again, his chair sliding backward and striking the window with enough force to rattle the glass. $50,000? I was supposed to inherit the business. I was going to expand into international markets and modernize the investment strategies. This is completely insane. The attorney's tone remained professionally neutral despite the emotional chaos surrounding him. The business succession plans you referenced were never formalized in legal documentation, Mr. Blackwood. Robert's actual intentions were quite different from your assumptions. Margaret spoke from her position at the end of the table, her voice carrying calm authority that cut through James's panic. The business expansion you mentioned has already been completed over the past 5 years. We established the international partnerships you wanted and modernized our investment approach using strategies you apparently never bothered to research. The family turned to stare at her with expressions that suggested they were seeing a complete stranger wearing Margaret's face. The quiet housewife who had endured their condescension was revealing herself to be a sophisticated business executive who had been managing their financial futures while they dismissed her as irrelevant. Mr. Harrison withdrew another folder and placed it before Margaret with obvious respect. These are the final documents that detail Mrs. Blackwood's complete inheritance. The family's country club memberships at Riverside Golf Club and the Metropolitan Athletic Club transfer to her name immediately. Victoria's mouth fell open as she realized even their social standing was being transferred away from them. The country club memberships represented more than recreation. They were symbols of status and connections that had defined the Blackwood family's place in society for decades. The attorney continued his systematic dismantling of their expectations. Mrs. Blackwood also inherits the collection of vintage automobiles housed at the estate garage, including the 1965 Aston Martin, the 1972 Ferrari, and the 1958 Rolls-Royce that belonged to Robert's father. Charles had loved those cars since childhood, spending countless hours in the garage learning about engines and restoration techniques from his father. The vehicles represented family history and masculine bonding across generations, not mere transportation or investments. Additionally, Mr. Harrison said as he turned to the final pages of the will, Mrs. Blackwood receives the vacation property in Martha's Vineyard, the ski lodge in Vail, and the beach house in the Hamptons, along with all furnishings and recreational equipment contained therein. Penelope began crying openly now, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of their losses. The vacation properties had been the setting for family gatherings and holiday celebrations spanning 30 years. They represented memories and traditions that seemed to be evaporating along with their inheritance. Mr. Harrison closed the will and folded his hands on the table before delivering what appeared to be his final explanation. These inheritance decisions were not made impulsively. Robert and his father spent years planning this transition to honor the original partnership with Edward Sinclair and to ensure that the family businesses would be managed by someone with the skills and dedication necessary for continued success. Margaret finally stood from her chair, her simple black dress suddenly seeming less like morning attire and more like executive business wear. Her voice carried quiet authority when she addressed the stunned family members. I've been aware of these inheritance arrangements since 2019, when Robert first showed me the revised will and explained his reasoning. James stared at her with growing horror as the implications of her words became clear. You've known for 4 years that you were going to inherit everything, and you just sat there while we treated you like garbage? Margaret's smile was polite, but completely lacking in warmth. I found your behavior quite educational, actually. It revealed exactly the kind of character flaws that convinced Robert his father's instincts were correct about keeping the family wealth away from people who hadn't earned it. Victoria struggled to maintain her dignity despite the magnitude of their reversal. But we're family. We're blood relatives who have loved Robert since birth. That has to count for something in these decisions. Margaret's response was delivered with devastating calm. Robert loved you all very much, which is why he provided trust funds that will ensure your basic financial security. However, love and business competence are entirely different qualifications for managing a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The conference room fell silent as the full scope of their miscalculations became undeniably clear. The woman they had dismissed as a fortune-hunting outsider was actually the rightful heir to their family legacy, a brilliant businesswoman who had been growing their wealth while they assumed superiority based solely on bloodline. Their years of cruel dismissal and condescending treatment had been directed at the very person who now controlled their financial futures. The irony was so complete it felt almost orchestrated by some cosmic sense of justice. Margaret remained standing at the end of the conference table for several long moments, allowing the full weight of the inheritance revelations to settle over the Blackwood family like dust after an explosion. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by Penelope's quiet sniffling and the distant hum of city traffic filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice carried an authority that none of them had ever heard before, clear and precise as surgical steel. Now that the legal formalities have been completed, I believe it's time for us to have a more personal conversation about the future and about the past. She walked slowly around the conference table, her modest black heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. Each step seemed deliberate and measured, like a general inspecting troops before delivering a crucial battle plan. The family members remained frozen in their chairs, uncertain whether they should flee or beg for mercy. "Victoria," Margaret said as she paused behind the older woman's chair, "I want to thank you for your educational comments yesterday about my need to find somewhere more suitable to my background. You mentioned Ohio, I believe. The irony is quite delicious, considering that my family has been funding your lifestyle from Ohio farmland investments for the past 15 years. Victoria's face flushed crimson as she realized her geographical dismissal had been directed at someone whose business empire actually included the very region she had used as an insult. Her voice emerged as barely a whisper when she tried to respond. "Margaret, I had no idea about your background or your contributions to the family. If I had known." Margaret held up one hand to stop the apology before it could gain momentum. "Oh, but you see, Victoria, that's precisely the point. You had no interest in learning about my background because you had already decided I was beneath your notice. Knowledge was available, but curiosity requires a certain humility you've never possessed." She continued her slow circuit around the table, stopping behind Charles's chair. "Charles, your comment about blood family being more important than marriage connections was particularly memorable. I'm curious how you feel about that philosophy now that you understand my blood connection to this family predates your own birth." Charles's military bearing had completely collapsed, leaving him looking like a deflated balloon in his expensive suit. His voice shook when he attempted a response. "Margaret, I spoke out of grief and confusion. Losing Robert was devastating for all of us, and I'm afraid we said things that don't reflect our true feelings." Margaret's laugh was musical but completely devoid of warmth. "Your true feelings were quite evident, actually. Grief has a way of stripping away social pretenses and revealing authentic character. Yesterday you were planning my eviction from Robert's house. Today you're discovering that I own the building where your law office is located." She paused beside James's chair, and the young man visibly flinched as if expecting a physical blow. "James, your commentary about my need to find work as a secretary was especially entertaining. I'm curious if you're still planning to modernize the family's investment strategies, given that you're about to discover you no longer work for the family investment firm." James's face went completely white as the implications of her words became clear. "What do you mean I no longer work for the firm? I've been employed there since graduating from Harvard. My entire career is built around that position." Margaret's smile was razor-sharp when she replied, "Your employment was contingent upon family ownership of the business. Since I now control Blackwood Investments, I'm implementing immediate personnel changes. Your termination paperwork will be processed this afternoon, effective immediately." The young man shot to his feet with panic-driven energy. "You can't do that. I have contracts and employment agreements." I have responsibilities and client relationships that depend on my continued involvement. Margaret's response was delivered with the calm authority of someone accustomed to making executive decisions. Your employment contract contains a standard clause allowing termination without cause upon change of ownership. Your client relationships will be transferred to more qualified personnel who understand the difference between competence and entitlement. Penelope found her voice through her tears, her words tumbling out in desperate pleading. Margaret, please, you have to understand that James was just speaking from emotion. He's a good boy with a bright future ahead of him. Surely there's room for family forgiveness in these circumstances. Margaret turned to face Penelope directly, her expression suggesting she was observing an interesting but ultimately irrelevant scientific specimen. Penelope, your son referred to me as someone taking a vacation from reality who should find work that matches my limited capabilities. Today he's discovering that I control his professional reality and his capabilities are more limited than he assumed. She returned to her position at the head of the table, standing where Mr. Harrison had delivered the legal revelations that shattered their world. Her presence seemed to fill the entire conference room as she prepared to deliver her final judgments. I want each of you to understand that every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every moment of deliberate humiliation over the past 2 years has been carefully noted and remembered, Margaret said with devastating precision. You treated me like an unwelcome intruder in my own family legacy, and now you're discovering that I am the legacy. Victoria attempted one final desperate appeal. Margaret, surely we can find some way to move forward as a family. We all made mistakes born from grief and misunderstanding. Can't we start fresh with this new knowledge? Margaret's response was delivered with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Victoria, starting fresh would require a foundation of mutual respect and genuine character that you've never demonstrated. Yesterday, you were planning to help me find a suitable apartment. Today, I'm deciding whether to allow you to keep yours. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small digital recorder, placing it on the conference table where everyone could see it clearly. This device contains recordings of several conversations from yesterday's reception, including your detailed discussions about dividing Robert's assets among yourselves and your plans for my immediate removal from the family. Charles stared at the recorder in horror as he realized the scope of her preparation. You recorded our private conversations? But we were grieving family members, sharing our concerns in what we thought was a safe space. Margaret's voice carried no sympathy when she replied. You were plotting the disposal of assets that belonged to someone else while celebrating the assumed departure of that person's widow. Privacy doesn't protect conspiracy, and grief doesn't excuse cruelty. She picked up the recorder and returned it to her purse before continuing with her devastating assessment. These recordings will be quite useful if any of you decide to challenge the will or contest my inheritance. They establish clear evidence of your motivations and your complete misunderstanding of the legal situation. James made one last desperate attempt to salvage his position. Margaret, I know I said terrible things, but I'm willing to learn and change. Can't you give me a chance to prove that I can be a valuable employee under your leadership? Margaret's smile was polite but absolutely glacial. James, your Harvard education apparently didn't include courses in basic human decency or business ethics. I prefer to work with people who possess both qualifications naturally rather than acquiring them under duress. Mr. Harrison began gathering his papers with practiced efficiency, clearly recognizing that the personal business was concluding. He addressed Margaret with obvious respect. Mrs. Blackwood, the transfer documents will require your signature at several points. Shall we schedule an appointment to complete the administrative details? Margaret nodded graciously. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Please prepare all necessary paperwork for execution this week. I'm eager to begin implementing some overdue changes in management structure and personnel policies. She turned to face the Blackwood family one final time, her expression suggesting she was viewing them from a great distance. I want to thank you all for providing such clear demonstrations of your character over the past 2 years. Your treatment of me has been incredibly educational and has confirmed that Robert's decisions were absolutely correct. Victoria made one final attempt at reconciliation. Margaret, we're still family. Surely there's some way we can rebuild our relationships on a foundation of honesty and respect. Margaret's response was delivered with devastating finality. Victoria, family relationships require mutual affection and genuine care. You've never shown interest in my thoughts, my feelings, or my well-being. Why would I want to continue a relationship based solely on your financial need? She walked toward the conference room door with the confident stride of someone who had just reclaimed their birthright. As she reached the threshold, she paused and delivered her final words to the stunned family members. Robert's funeral was held yesterday, but today marks the burial of your assumptions about your importance in this family's future. I hope you find your reduced circumstances educational. Margaret stepped out into the law firm's elegant reception area, leaving behind the crystal chandelier and expensive furniture and the three family members who had spent 2 years underestimating the quiet woman who now controlled their destiny. Mr. Harrison followed her out and escorted her to the elevator bank with obvious deference. The building's valet had already brought her vehicle to the front entrance, but it wasn't the modest sedan she had driven to the funeral. Instead, Robert's vintage Rolls-Royce waited at the curb, its pristine silver paint gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Through the law office windows 20 stories above, the Blackwood family watched in stunned silence as Margaret settled into the luxury vehicle's leather interior. The car pulled away from the curb with whisper-quiet dignity, carrying their former victim toward a future where she would never again tolerate their condescension. Victoria, Charles, Penelope, and James remained standing in the conference room for several minutes after her departure, trying to process the complete reversal of everything they had believed about their family's hierarchy. The woman they had dismissed as a temporary inconvenience had revealed herself to be their permanent superior in every meaningful way. Have you ever seen justice serve this perfectly in your own life? There's something deeply satisfying about watching arrogance meet its match, especially when the underdog turns out to hold all the cards. Hit that like button if this story gave you the same satisfaction it gave me, and subscribe for more stories where the quietly powerful get their ultimate revenge. 6 months later, Margaret had transformed the family businesses with impressive efficiency. Blackwood Manufacturing expanded into 3 new international markets under her leadership. The real estate portfolio grew by 40% through strategic acquisitions that James had never imagined possible. The investment funds achieved record returns using innovative strategies that Victoria's outdated approach could never have generated. Victoria moved from her expensive downtown penthouse to a modest suburban apartment, supported by her quarterly trust fund payments. She spent her days volunteering at charity organizations, finally learning humility through genuine service rather than performing it for social appearances. Charles and Penelope relocated to a smaller city where their reduced income allowed for comfortable living without the constant reminder of their former status. They discovered that happiness didn't require luxury vehicles and country club memberships, though they never stopped regretting their treatment of Margaret. James struggled the most with the transition from entitled heir to ordinary job seeker. His Harvard credentials opened doors, but his lack of practical experience and work ethic quickly closed them again. He eventually found employment with a small firm willing to overlook his reputation in exchange for his willingness to work long hours for modest compensation. Margaret established a charitable foundation in Robert's memory, focusing on educational opportunities for children from modest backgrounds. She endowed scholarships at Stanford and Wharton, ensuring that future generations would have access to the same opportunities that had enabled her success. The Blackwood estate was transformed into a conference center for nonprofit organizations, its elegant rooms hosting fundraising events and strategic planning sessions for causes Margaret supported. The Persian rugs and crystal chandeliers now witnessed discussions about social justice rather than social exclusion. On quiet evenings, Margaret would sit in the rose garden where she and Robert had planned their shared future. She would remember his gentle wisdom and his father's promises to Edward Sinclair, feeling grateful that justice had been served with such poetic precision. The woman who had been dismissed as powerless had claimed her rightful place as the architect of the family's future. The relatives who had laughed at the widow discovered that laughter could be a very expensive luxury when directed at someone who controlled the bank accounts. In the end, Margaret Sinclair Blackwood had inherited exactly what she deserved, while the Blackwood family learned that blood alone was never enough to guarantee anything worth having. Character, competence, and compassion had triumphed over arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty. The quiet woman had spoken, and her voice had changed everything.